In the previous video, Madame Zhu passed away and left her company to the protagonist in her will, which angered her children. However, Doohee can only officially take over the presidency if she marries within a year. Upon learning this, the protagonist approached Gu Won, the demon destined to stay close to this simple human to use his powers, and proposed marriage to him. Do you think he accepted? Gu Won's response to Doohee's proposal was a quick, "I don't want to," which shocked everyone, especially the protagonist herself. After this, Doohee decided to leave, and despite rejecting her, Gu Won remained faithful to his job as her bodyguard. Meanwhile, Madame Zhu's children began plotting to prevent the protagonist from taking over the company. The eldest son recalled an old memory of desperately crying to his mother, claiming he was drunk and unaware of someone, while Madame Zhu spoke on the phone with someone, saying he would pay the price for his crime. Back to the protagonist, she went up to her apartment alone, venting loudly about her frustration at Gu Won's rejection, thinking no one was listening. However, she had forgotten the letter Madame Zhu had written to her in his car. As Gu Won came up to deliver it, he overheard everything and decided to leave quietly so she wouldn't take her anger out on him. Someone else heard a bit of the protagonist's venting, Sukun, who came to check on Doohee. She confided in him about her suspicions regarding Madame Zhu's death and the attempts on her life, sharing everything with the only person she considered family. Before leaving, Sukun added his number as an emergency contact on Doohee's phone, so she could call for help immediately if anything else happened. In the next scene, we see the protagonist asking to meet Gu Won. After their conversation, while he was driving her home, Doohee fell asleep in the car, which was unusual for her. This indicated she felt safe around him. He took the opportunity to return the letter she had left behind. Upon reaching her apartment, the protagonist decided to add Gu Won's number as an emergency contact as well. As she read Madame Zhu's letter, we see that in the following days, the protagonist followed the steps the lady had asked her to take. However, Madame Zhu's children opposed everything, denying requests for another autopsy on their mother and even slapping Doohee. Madame Zhu's condition for Doohee to marry was because she didn't want her to face everything alone. Madame Zhu confessed she only managed to stay strong with the protagonist by her side. In the next scene, Gu Won's memories from when he was human began to return, and it seemed everyone called him Master Yi-sun. This meant that without his powers, the man was reverting to being a simple human, meaning he would soon start aging as well. At the company, the protagonist and Gu Won spent the day analyzing security camera footage from Madame Zhu's house, which Doohee's secretary had obtained. In the end, they realized they were too late, as the footage had already been edited. Sukun informed the protagonist that the computers of other company victims who had lost their lives had also been wiped clean. The scene cuts to a man targeting the protagonist, who sent an anonymous tip to the gang after Gu Won, revealing his identity and location. It would now be difficult to protect her with these forces united. Back to Doohee, Gu Won accepted an invitation from some of the protagonist's office colleagues to go drinking, and of course, he dragged her along. The two found themselves in a place they weren't accustomed to frequenting. Gu Won accepted the invitation as an opportunity to pretend that something was happening between him and Doohee. He held her wrist under the table, causing their colleagues to suspect they were a couple. However, Gu Won ruined the night by saying something unpleasant, leading to a fight between him and the protagonist. She dismissed him from his bodyguard duties, and they walked in opposite directions down an alley. As this happened, the gang found Gu Won and began attacking him. Meanwhile, the protagonist grew worried when he didn't answer her calls and went looking for him. When Doohee found him, he was bleeding, surrounded by the gang. She used the self-defense tools she had bought and went to Gu Won. When he grabbed her wrist, they began dancing the tango, and in a unique way, they defeated everyone targeting him. Unbeknownst to the couple, the protagonist's stalker was also present and recorded everything. When they arrived at Doohee's building, Gu Won acted strangely and left without saying anything. The protagonist was confused, and viewers discovered that the man was beginning to develop feelings for her. The protagonist also suspected that Gu-won might be developing feelings for her, so she went to his company to clarify things. There, she met Jean, a star who had harbored feelings for the demon for a long time, yet they remained unrequited. In the end, Gu-won acted as if he was annoyed by Do-hee's presence, leading her to believe her earlier thoughts were just in her head, so she decided to return home. Meanwhile, we see Suk-min with the audit team, and he once again bought them off by threatening to expose them for corruption if they didn't side with him. His son, Do Jae-young, ended the life of the doctor treating his mental health. It seems everyone in Madame Ju's lineage is quite unconcerned about their misdeeds. The protagonist's stalker handed over the video he recorded of the two dancing the tango and defeating the gang to the person ordering these attacks against her. Although they didn't know what Gu-won was, they realized they needed to separate the two. The next day, a strange man with a helmet entered Do-hee's company. As a precaution, the protagonist's secretary hit him on the head with a folder, as he seemed very suspicious. When he fell to the ground and the helmet was removed, it turned out to be Mr. Park, Gu-won's secretary. He had dressed this way to avoid drawing attention, but it didn't work out. Later, Miss Shin apologized to Mr. Park at the protagonist's request, and we noticed that the two would have a relationship of teasing each other, even competing over who had the better boss. However, the secretary wasn't entirely wrong to hit the man, as we see that the stalker had already infiltrated Do-hee's company. In the next scene, a meeting with the audit team was taking place, and an interim president was elected until Do-hee married or the company was passed to Suk-min. As we saw, the eldest son had bought most of the voting members and won the vote. Later, in the protagonist's car, Suk-hoon showed her what he found suspicious about the company's financial situation. It turned out that 2 years ago, the Myri Group bought a ship from a company for a large sum of money. Surprisingly, no one knew the ship's whereabouts, and when he continued investigating, Do-hee's cousin discovered that the corporation had recently closed its doors. This all pointed to a classic accounting fraud, and Suk-hoon promised to dig deeper to help the protagonist. The next step for Do-hee was to find someone to marry. Since Gu-won had rejected her, she sought out the man who was supposed to be her blind date. Although he wasn't her type, he became a good option since having a prosecutor by her side would cut through many obstacles when dealing with Madame Ju's children. Do-hee arranged to register her marriage with the prosecutor at the registry office in 2 hours. However, Gu-won couldn't bear to see the unhappiness on her face any longer. To help her avoid marriage, he went to the new gang leader to try to strike a deal for their assistance in catching the culprit. But things started to get out of control, and Gu-won began taking his anger out on the leader. This prompted Do-hee to ask what his problem was and why he was acting this way. At that moment, the demon confessed that he had a perfect life before she appeared and that if they hadn't met that day, everything might still be fine. Thus, the protagonist decided to dismiss him once again, saying she didn't need him anymore. When she got home and was preparing for bed, Do-hee heard music coming from her living room and began to suspect that her stalker might be in her house. She grabbed her self-defense tools and cautiously approached the room, but on the way, she was caught from behind and fainted. When she woke up, she was hanging from her building's balcony, and the man seemed to be enjoying the situation. He started cutting the fabric holding the protagonist, and just as Do-hee began to fall, Gu-won appeared and grabbed her wrist. When the stalker grabbed her, her phone sent a message to her emergency contacts. As soon as he received the alert, Gu-won rushed to save her. Back on the balcony, the stalker hadn't left and even tried to make them both fall. However, by holding Do-hee's wrist, Gu-won managed to get them to the building's emergency stairs. The protagonist couldn't say anything, only hugging him and crying. At that moment, her cousin arrived, and they all returned to Do-hee's apartment. It seemed the stalker had broken the apartment's lock to get in. Since there were cameras in her residence, the protagonist accessed them via her phone. both she and Gu-won noticed it was the same man due to marks on the back of his neck. However, his face appeared different, as if he was wearing a mask. This realization frightened Do-hee even more. She realized her stalker could be anyone around her, and for the first time, she understood the fear of losing her life. Suk-hoon, as always, told the protagonist she didn't need to face any of this alone and proposed to her. But he wasn't the only one. Gu-won had a change of heart and also proposed. From having no options, she now had 3. The protagonist responded that she needed time to think. The next day, Suk-hoon went to the protagonist's company to deliver flowers and apologize for his unexpected proposal. They laughed and enjoyed themselves as usual. Outside, Gu-won watched them and seemed to feel jealous. Later, Suk-hoon confessed his feelings to Do-hee, revealing what he had felt for her all this time. However, as we already know, her feelings for him were different. Later, in the car with Gu-won, she questioned why he had proposed when he had previously rejected her. He confessed that he didn't want her to lose her life. In the next scene, we see the protagonist attending an inauguration ceremony with all of Madame Ju's family present. She announced to them that she would be getting married the next day. Do-hee also managed to identify her stalker among the crowd, but before she could act, he had disappeared. The next day, the big day arrived. When she was alone, Do-hee got lost in her thoughts and ended up talking to Madame Ju, which brought her some comfort. We then moved to the ceremony, which was perfect. We discovered that the protagonist and Gu-won had made an agreement to achieve their goals, committing to appear as a real couple to others. Suk-hoon attended his beloved's wedding, and she explained that he was perfect for the commitment. Even though he wasn't chosen, he would always be her family. In the next scene, we see the protagonist's stalker having a breakdown in his hideout. It appeared he had attended the ceremony, as there was a photo of the newlyweds that he pinned to the wall with a knife through Gu-won's image. Returning to the couple, Gu-won moved into Do-hee's house, and she discovered that his powers could be used for cleaning as well. The two began to relax and become less tense. Later, reflecting on Do Jae-young's surprise at seeing her at the inauguration ceremony and the strange smile he had at her wedding, the protagonist started to suspect that he might be involved in the attempts on her life. The next day, they began using Gu-won's powers to follow Do Jae-young. They discovered that he left his car in a part of the city to continue traveling by subway. The protagonist thought this might be his meeting point with her stalker. Indeed, Do Jae-young went to a locker where the man appeared to leave the victim's belongings. As a viewer, I think if it were him, it would be too obvious. I believe he might be involved but not the mastermind behind everything. Returning to the story, Do Jae-young noticed the people in the photo booth were watching him. As he approached, Gu-won tried to get them out, but for some reason, his powers didn't work when the flashes indicating pictures were being taken started. So, he decided to kiss Do-hee to hide their faces. When Do Jae-young opened the curtain, he couldn't identify them, or at least that's what I think. Before leaving, Gu-won grabbed the photos of him and the protagonist. The two encountered a homeless woman at the station. Initially, she seemed to be rambling, but then she mentioned to Gu-won that if something was failing, it meant that after a while, it wouldn't work anymore. Do-hee thought the woman might be referring to his powers, but since Gu-won said he didn't know her and they should ignore her, the protagonist simply obeyed. What did you think of these episodes? I hope you enjoyed the summary. Leave your suggestions in the comments and subscribe. If you liked the video, please like and share it to help me out. See you next time.